Joint pain, want bigger muscles, balding, just insert any possible problem and there's a peptide for that.
I think when everyone does their 2026 retrospectives, peptides is going to be like prominent in that word cloud.
The core structure is amino acids, but that doesn't necessarily tell you that it's safe, effective, or bad either. I'm not saying one way or the other. If it's a research chemical, I'm pretty much saying no 100% of the time. You're injecting this, which is like a straight up pathway for if there's a bacteria in there or heavy metals. You can't guarantee safety. Almost universally, the evidence is absent. You can assume safety, but you know what they say about assumptions.
All right, let's dance.
Cool, let's dance. All right, Foster Kamer, walking as always.
Yeah.
In New York.
Taking a stroll.
Taking a stroll. All right, so why I wanted to call you is when we launched the 2% podcast, which you were instrumental in. Thank you very much for that. I said, what ideas do you have, man? And you said, peptides. You need to do peptides. Peptides. Why'd you say peptides? Why was that the first thing out of your mouth?
It's the buzzword. It's the buzz product of the last year. Like, I think when everyone does their 2026 retrospectives, peptides is going to be like prominent in that word cloud.
Yeah.
People have been talking about peptides nonstop for the last year, really in New York and LA longer than that. And I should mention here, the first time I ever heard about peptides was actually in 2021. I was dating somebody who basically flew off to Malibu at the beginning of the pandemic. And she had long COVID. And one of these Malibu LA doctors recommended that she start taking peptides and injecting these peptides into her stomach herself in order to help alleviate the symptoms of long COVID. As far as I know, they didn't help. I think there was a placebo effect. Injecting something was,
terrible.
Yeah. And so you got to think that's doing something. But ultimately, as far as I know, it didn't help at all. But that's all to demonstrate that peptides in 2021 were being prescribed by some doctors for long COVID. Now they're being prescribed for everything.
Everything. Joint pain, want bigger muscles, balding, just insert any possible problem and there's a peptide for that. So what I'm here to tell you is that I have found one of the world's foremost experts in peptides. His name is Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum. He's an MD. Now, I would say this guy, medically conservative, but at the same time, total fitness bro. He has some like powerlifting world record. So I feel like, he sits in kind of like this middle ground. Won't be too critical. At the same time, I don't know, maybe he'll tell everyone to not take him. So what questions do you have for this guy?
Oh, I have so many questions for him.
Fire away.
The fact is, I cannot tell you at all what a peptide actually does. I don't know what its function is. I don't know what all of these people who are suddenly injecting Chinese peptides are putting into their bodies. I don't know if they know it either. And listen, I once heard a quote that's like, you don't need to know how electricity works in order to use it. Fair, right? We put a lot of medicine and things in our body that we don't know how they work. Injecting various liquids from China that are, as of this moment, illegal in America, although all the barriers to regulation are soon to be vaporized. That's a little different.
Here's my question. Yeah. True or false, you can buy peptides at bodegas in New York City? Because I see things on Instagram, people taking photos of bodegas in New York that are selling gray market peptides. And I'm like, is that real? Is that not real? You're in New York right now.
Yeah. There's a bodega right there, but I know for a fact that they don't sell peptides. They barely sell like good egg sandwiches. The fact is like, listen, I can find out for you, but probably bodegas are magical places. So it wouldn't surprise me that one could buy peptides at a bodega.
Questions we want answered. 1, what are they?
Mm-hmm.
2, what the hell do they do?
Yeah.
3, I think, is this as sketchy as the whole bodega gray market vibe makes it appear? or is it not as sketchy? Are there other places to get them that aren't sketchy? And then finally, of course, you want to know, this guy's a doctor. He's reading all the data. What does the data actually show about these things? Do they actually do what they claim? And if yes, how do we know that? Are the studies in rats or are they in actual humans?
Also, why are they just coming up now? Like, what is with the recent surge in popularity for these things? What prompted that? What elicited that surge? Why now? And you know, mind you, I should say, have you ever heard the expression a product of Madison Avenue?
Tell us.
Yeah, well, it basically is just like, this is something that the coastal elites are selling on the rest of America, right? Advertising firms in New York and LA selling things on America. Well, culturally, this is something that New York and LA has sold on the rest of America. And the spread by which this thing has come about, I mean, it feels like a kind of medical euphoria, almost like this panacea, this snake oil. Why?
Yeah.
Like, you know, people are always looking for a miracle drug. And look, my suspicion is that because we live in the age of the miracle drug, the COVID vaccine, sorry, but it's true. The COVID vaccine, GLP-1s, you know.
Which are a peptide. See, this is what throws me for the loop, is that GLP-1s are technically peptides.
Really?
Those have had a huge effect. And yet, there's all this other stuff. Now they can do everything. Now it's like, oh, your hair's a little thin, peptide for that. Knee feels a little, creaky, peptide for that. You don't have any libido anymore? Yeah, just inject this in your stomach. The boner will reappear.
See, but I suspect, if I'm to posit a theory, that the deal with peptides are going to be a little bit like the deal with whiskeys and bourbons. All bourbons are whiskeys, but not all whiskeys are bourbons. Maybe all GLP-1s are peptides, but not all peptides are GLP-1s.
All right, I feel like we got a good foundation.
Yeah, good luck on your quest for more. Keep me informed. Let me know if I need to shoot some ambiguous Chinese liquid into my ass anytime soon.
From the bodega. The bodega's right there. I just saw you pass it.
Yeah. I'll go in and get an egg sandwich too.
Why don't you go in and get that shitty egg sandwich and ask them if they sell peptides and then text me whether or not, and we will let people know you're able to get peptides at the end.
Deal.
All right, I got my marching orders from Foster. Now we're going to bring on Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum, who is going to give us a Peptide 101 and what you need to learn about them. All right, Jordan, you are an MD. You did your residency, the whole bit, but I also feel somewhat safe saying that you're not the average doctor in the sense that you have top rankings in powerlifting. You spend a lot of the time in the gym. And so given this whole world of peptides, I wanted to bring you on because of the fact of the MD, but also I also feel like peptides are kind of hot in the fitness wellness space. And where I want to start is just at the most basic level. What is a peptide?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for having me. So peptide is a chemistry word, and it just means a short chain of amino acids. And I think anybody who's posted about them, I don't know if it's the AI or the LLMs are all pulling this together, but they say, oh, it's just a short chain of amino acids, which is true from a chemistry perspective. But that is not really sufficient to define what a peptide drug is or peptide medication is. And that's what people are talking about here. Because when you define like what a medication is, it's anything other than a food that's intended to affect the structure or function of the body. And so that's a drug by definition.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about a peptide drug, it is a drug or medication that is made out of a short chain of amino acids. And interestingly, about 6 years ago, there was a sort of classification sort of system that came out. It's called the FDA's Bright Line Rule, which basically means any medication that's made out of a short chain of amino acids that's 40 amino acids or shorter is a peptide drug. So semaglutide, which people know as Ozempic or Wegovy, that's a peptide drug. Whereas if it's above 40 amino acids, now it's a protein drug or a biologic.
Okay.
Interestingly, when I was going through my medical training, you're taught that insulin is a peptide drug, basically. And every other physician I know calls it a peptide drug.
Okay.
Although technically under its new classification, it's a protein drug. Anyway, that's mostly a nomenclature thing. But I think what people need to know is that, the core structure is amino acids, but that doesn't necessarily tell you that it's safe, effective, or bad either. I'm not saying one way or the other. It's just a chemistry term, and then it's a drug because of how it's being used.
Yeah, and fatty acids, short-chain fatty acids are in food as well. Is that why it can get confusing?
The short chain amino acids, yeah. I mean, a whey protein supplement or any protein supplement, effectively, that is a long chain of amino acids, which would be a peptide, and so you'll see this interesting thing. This kind of reminds me of like when blockchain came out, and like anything that associated blockchain with whatever, the stock took off or the product did really well. You'll see peptide now attached to like various supplements, and it's like, well, this was always a peptide because it was a protein based sort of thing. Anyway, but it mainly about use kind of directs you whether or not it's a food, it's a medication, or something else entirely.
Okay, so you mentioned GLP-1s are technically peptides. I feel like when people say online and with a lot of the discourse, I'm taking peptides, they're usually not referring to GLP-1s. They're referring to these sort of like injectable drugs that are supposed to kind of do everything. So what are we kind of referring to here when you hear peptides online and it's sort of wellness discourse?
Yeah. Now, to be clear, some of the peptide drugs that are being sold through various markets, whether it's a research chemical or a compounding pharmacy or a brand name drug, it could be a GLP-1. Some people are taking semaglutide, right? And they're getting it from various sources. That's a GLP-1. Or retatrutide. It is a GLP-1, although it's a triple agonist because it has a GIP agonist and a glucagon receptor agonist as well, which is not FDA approved yet, but it's still a peptide-based drug. But effectively, peptide drugs, I mean, we've had these since the 1920s. 1920, insulin is synthesized.
Wow.
30 years later, a few other vasopressin and oxytocin show up. So peptide drugs have been, there are hundreds that have been approved and ultimately used in medicine. These newer ones are generally projects that come out of big pharma, where they have identified a drug that does a thing, or at least they think it does, and then they either go to test it and it didn't pan out, or they tested it and it didn't quite do what they thought it would, and they usually abandon them. That's probably half, for example, of the peptide drugs that recently got voted on in the FDA's, commission vote, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
And the other half or so are too new to have been tested, right? They've like recently been identified, and then because they're peptide, somebody's figured out the chemical structure, and many of these things have been published, like the actual chemical structure, and so somebody makes them, and then fitness people, being how they are, present company included, we're like, hey, would this be beneficial to me? It's like one of those things. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting mix. You have everything from stuff that is 30, 40 years old to stuff that's literally you're on the bleeding edge of pharmaceutical research.
Yeah. What are the most popular peptides right now, barring GLP-1s, the ones you've already identified, like insulin? And then what are people taking them for?
That is another great question. So I would say, and again, this is subjective, it's just kind of my read of, not only like SEO, AEO, GEO, like this sort of nerdy, what's happening on the internet.
Yeah.
BPC 157 seems to probably be the most popular non-GLP-1 peptide, and maybe even further to specify the approved FDA, non-FDA approved sort of peptides. And when I say FDA, I'm not protecting them. I'm just saying like there's no agreed upon indication for this drug. There's not a lot of evidence that has sufficiently told the FDA scientists to say, hey, yeah, we should approve this so that people can make it, distribute it, prescribe it, or whatever. Okay. So BPC 157 probably is the most popular.
I've heard of that one a lot.
Yeah. TB 500 would be another one. Those two are sometimes combined together in what's called a Wolverine stack for like injury recovery, for example. There's KPV, which is also for like wound healing, but maybe inflammatory conditions as well. MOTS-C is something that your mitochondria make, and this is supposed to be like an exercise mimetic, so kind of mimicking what exercise could do. So potential treatments for obesity, or for example. There's all sorts of other ones, including CMAX, which has been studied for like neurological disorders, particularly like stroke rehab and stuff. Epidolon, which is for insomnia. DSIP, which is also for insomnia, maybe for some opioid withdrawal stuff as well. There's a number of them. They kind of keep coming up. It's like almost whack-a-mole. You feel like you've got a good handle on what's coming out, and then a new one pops up. So it is pretty interesting. But I do think that BPC 157, at least by my, as far as I can tell, is probably the most popular, and then of the non-GLP-1 agents.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's the one that I hear about the most. I definitely hear about the Wolverine stack. And to your point, I feel like the way I hear of them most tends to be in fitness circles. There's like these fitness recovery benefits, maybe some reduced pain in your joints. But then to your point, you start seeing other ones pop up. Well, this one does X, this one does Y, this one does Z. And it's kind of like this big net that's like, you got a problem, we got a peptide for that coming down the pipe. So then the next most important, this is the most important question. Is there any evidence, good evidence, that these do what marketers claim? If I go onto the peptide dealer website, whatever it might be, how strong is the evidence?
I mean, almost universally, the evidence is absent. And so, we say in science that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and, this sort of thing. So basically, you need data to show that either something works or that it doesn't work. And that is true. When we just think about BPC 157, if we agree that this is like one of the most popular peptide drugs out there, you'd say, okay, well, look, what's the human evidence on this? And so you, to date, have no published human randomized controlled trial data, period.
Why is it important to have human randomized controlled trial data?
Well, it's a great question. And so if you were saying, for example, BPC 157 helps with tendon healing, right? There are a number of different ways you can arrive at that conclusion. You can start with animal modeling or even Petri dish modeling. Put some cells from a tendon or a ligament in a Petri dish and then expose it to BPC 157. Obviously, I'm simplifying. And you see some benefits there, what growth, remodeling, whatever. You're like, cool. So that's a sort of a proof of concept.
Okay.
Then you might do that in an animal model, maybe. And then you would want to translate that to humans, because this breaks down so often in pharmaceutical development where you have a mechanism, maybe even show some promise in animal models, and then you give it to humans and it doesn't really change outcomes.
Okay.
And so you might see something in humans where it's like, for example, there's a study right now registered. They're recruiting patients for BPC 157 with acute hamstring strain, right? And you look at the study design, and what they're looking at is like MRI changes. So just stuff on an image, which is not nothing. But you and me, or you and I, for example, if we had a hamstring strain, I don't really care what my MRI looks like. I care about, does my hamstring feel better? Do I have full strength? Do I have full, so there are various levels of this. The whole point is this. If you were trying to say that BPC 157 helps tendon repair, ligament repair, you would want to see that documented in humans, thing one, and then in the specific context you're going to use it in. So for example, is it in tendinopathy? Is it post-surgical sort of situation? Is it acute trauma? And so you would want that evidence to feel comfortable, like, yeah, it does this thing. Or if it does do this thing, here's the magnitude of effect. Here are the potential side effects to look out for, the potential interactions. And so when you have these drugs, potentially very powerful agents, and you have either no human data, which is the case on many of these, or very, very thin human data, it's hard to feel confident that they're actually doing stuff. It doesn't mean that they don't work. It doesn't mean that I hate them. It doesn't mean I'm telling you not to use them. I'm just saying, like, I'm not confident that they do stuff. I'm also not confident that they don't do stuff because we kind of don't know.
We need to find out is the point. It's almost like with the Petri dish to animal models to human and then what for. It's kind of like a lottery ticket where, all right, Petri dish worked out. Oh, we got a couple numbers on the ticket. Then it works in animals. We go, oh my God, we got 3 more numbers. We're doing well. Yep. And then we take it to humans and it's like, if that all works, then we can say, we hit the lottery for this specific case. It tends to work in most people most of the time. But again, how often does the lottery hit? With most trials, like, they don't pan out.
Exactly right. And that's the whole thing. People get excited, and myself included, about mechanisms like, ooh, this cool thing's coming down the pike. Yes, this is going to be a game changer. I'm excited. And then it fizzles. And the opposite happens where you're like, the signal doesn't look that great. And then you try it in humans, you're like, wow, this did work. That's incredible. So ultimately, a lottery ticket, that's a great explanation here.
So I have a friend who had a foot tendon problem, some sort of vague foot problem, I'll say. He started taking, I believe it was BPC 157, and his foot pain healed. So what can that tell us? And I want you to talk about this. I've seen you post on Instagram, which you have a great feed I would suggest everyone follow, about this sham knee surgery you compared that to. So walk us through that.
Yeah. Pain and musculoskeletal dysfunction at large is super interesting space. Been in here for over a decade, just kind of like, effectively, I'm trolling myself, right? Because you have all these beliefs, these preconceived notions, belief systems, hierarchy, or whatever. And ultimately, when you look at the literature, you just keep getting kind of turned around. You're like, man, my prior assumptions were wrong. Got to update my priors here. And so in this whole space, one thing we've been trying to move away from is this sort of structure harm that causes the pain, and then you have to fix that structure and then pain goes away, because that is not sufficient to really explain people's pain experiences. There are biological inputs, sure, which can deal with like abnormal anatomy, various trauma, etc. But there are psychological influences, social influences, environmental influences, and that all collates together to get to the pain experience.
Yeah. So an example of this, just to be clear, is going back to your MRI example. Let's say something looks weird on an MRI. Well, that person may not be experiencing pain.
Totally.
Or they might. Or an MRI might look perfect, but hey, this person's still in pain at this site. So what the hell is going on?
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. And so that's why just changes in imaging is insufficient to really document this. And that's been well studied. You have people with, to put it bluntly, crazy looking imaging, and they have above average function or even like elite level function when it comes to professional sports. And so then you have to start asking yourself, well, is this a feature of the adaptive processes that have taken place, right? Or is it a bug? You think about tennis players, for example, their dominant arm tends to grow relative to their non-dominant arm, their serve hand, just based on, the use. Yeah. And you're like, well, that is an asymmetry, but it's a beneficial one. So anyway, so back to this sort of, okay, you did X, you observed Y response. How do you correlate these things? And is it causal, right? Because correlation is not causation. And so we have to kind of parse these things. And so there've been a number of what are called sham trials, all right? Sham trials where basically they do a mock surgery. They make the incision, in this case for knee pain, for meniscus related pain, or at least what was thought. And so, the thought is, meniscus is damaged. Let's go fix it. And people are going to get better. Well, what if we compare that to just making some incisions in the skin and then, a sham surgery and see, is there a difference with the surgery? And this was done in 2002. This study was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. They took individuals with arthritis. They either had an arthroscopic surgery or sham surgery.
So with the sham surgery, they're getting their knee just an incision. So the person who got it thinks they got the full surgery, to be clear. But they didn't actually get the surgery. They just got sort of a, hey, maybe you got it, maybe you didn't.
Yeah, they didn't know. How would they know? Unless they had their own personal imaging, thing at home. So yeah, at 2 years, there was no real difference in pain and function outcomes. And so
no difference.
And that's surgery. Now, I'm not trying to compare BPC to surgery. I'm just saying that, look, even the most dramatic, or sometimes we call a clinical theatrics, right? Even the most dramatic example, surgery, there's a placebo element there. Right. And so when people say, look, I had this elbow pain, shoulder pain, foot pain in the case of your friend, and I took BPC and it got better. And it's like, I believe your experience is true. I believe the timeline of events. I believe you're, honest historian here, but I don't know that that's causal. One, because other things could have changed. Right. You could have adjusted your exercise. You could have adjusted other environmental inputs, sleep, nutrition, et cetera, and so on and so forth. The natural history of many pain and musculoskeletal type syndromes is to wax and wane and ultimately get better over time. That can happen. And then further, your belief system is that, hey, I'm taking this thing. It's potentially very powerful, right? I got to inject it. The clinical theatrics are high. I suspect there's some element of placebo, even if it's not all placebo. But because we don't have good evidence here to say that, look, this does work better than placebo, it's hard to parse. And so I think you have that potential backed up against well, what are the risks, right? And then you're like, well, shoot, there's no real safety data on this either. That's tough from a clinical perspective to feel confident, yeah, this works. Yes, it's safe. And then 3, we should be recommending it to a bunch of people. That's tough.
Yeah. Are there any out there that you think are promising but improving? Are there anywhere you're going, maybe there's some there, or where do you sit there?
That's a great question. So I think where I sit is that, BPC 157, for example, I have a number of problems with it. One, most of them are based in antiquity, meaning that because this was discovered in the 1990s, right? And there was subsequently been a few different clinical trials that have been started and either not finished, so terminated early, or their results were never published. And for example, we don't even know where BPC 157 comes from. It was reported originally that it came from like your stomach juice, human stomach juice. But then when you look at like the original patent papers, that's not true. And there's no homology for us to make that peptide. So you're like, oh, I don't know. It seems a little sketchy. I'm not saying it doesn't work, but like that the fact that it's been around for so long, we still don't know where it came from. Pharmaceutical companies have acquired this drug three separate times, and ultimately it hasn't panned out. That's kind of a red flag for me. But so that I'm less optimistic about BPC 157 panning out, but I'm open to it.
Yeah.
I'm more open to some of the newer peptide drugs that are coming out now. A lot of those are not being sold, from these individuals. For example, retatrutide is a peptide drug, but look, it's got phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials with decent evidence, and I'm more optimistic that that's going to be a pretty good game changer in that space. There are other peptide drugs coming out after that have additional targets as well related to that space. But like MOTS-C, for example, I am more optimistic about that mainly because it's new, but I'm still awaiting any human data to say, yeah, hey, look, using MOTS-C, injecting it, for example, is helpful. Right now, we just have characterized like, yeah, your mitochondria produce it when you exercise, and we can make it. So maybe taking it is beneficial, especially for individuals who can't exercise or can't exercise as much as they want to. That's theoretically sound, at least to me. So let's test it. So I would say that I'm most optimistic about the newer drugs than I am about the older ones, mainly because if the older ones had such a promising signal, I do believe big pharma is in the business of making money, and I think they would have pursued it on some level. And so that's kind of why I'm a little standoffish on those. But ultimately, I still want data either way, to kind of figure out which way we should lean here.
Yeah, pivoting into, you mentioned safety. Are there any that you would say stay the hell away from this at all costs?
I mean, I don't want to scare anybody because, especially if the data is thin. So I think I have to rely on like where there is a pretty decent signal for maybe some issues. Melanotan 2, for example, that's going to be voted on at the next meeting that they hold for kind of moving some of these drugs off of what's known as the category 2 bulk list. Yeah. There's been case reports of new and maybe worsening melanoma, for example.
Oh, wow.
Kidney failure, rhabdomyolysis, priapism, which is an erection that lasts way, way too long and ultimately requires some pretty gnarly surgery to correct sometimes. The one drug that was voted against on the latest that FDA vote was DSIP, I believe, mainly because if you overdose it, people will die.
Oh, wow.
Which was problematic. Yeah. So ultimately I was like, okay, maybe that one has a pretty significant sort of safety flag, but all of these, when there's a lack of either pharmaceutical testing, like pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic testing, where you don't know how long does it last, what receptor does it go on, attached to, or receptors does it attach to, what other drugs does it interact with? All of those represent some safety data that I'm kind of like, I don't know, man. So yeah, it's pretty challenging space to navigate, especially as a clinician when you're kind of like, the people that are using these, they're using them for a totally different purpose, really, than your traditional prescribing habits. Yeah. Most of the time people have either a medical condition, whether it's acute or chronic, and you're like, look, we need to change multiple things to try to address this fully. A lot of these drugs are more for like optimization. The person's already healthy, at least as far as they know, and they're like, I want better. And you're like, well, that's different. And how do you study that? Yeah. So either way, it's kind of challenging. And I just think from a prescriber's standpoint, it's like, we don't want to do any harm. It's hard to know what the potential risks and the potential benefits are when there's no evidence here. And so that's a really difficult conversation to have with respect to like informed consent, in my opinion.
With the popular ones, are there any common side effects, or do we just not know because of the lack of data?
Yeah. I mean, there are anecdotal reports for various side effects, whether it's, localized site reactions, people, oh, this burns when I inject it, for example, or, oh, you get a little nausea after this, with respect to like PT141 or melanotan 2. The GHKCU has some like people get flushing and burning, whatever. But because there's no monitoring systems in place, right, you don't really know. And so that's kind of one of the common pushback. People are like, oh, well, there's no documented harm here. It's like, well, yeah, there's no monitoring system set up either, which is what you would want if you were really looking for that sort of stuff. And because no one's really looking, you're kind of just waiting for maybe the worst of the worst to show up. Like, oh, I injected this thing, which I thought was whatever, KPV, TB500, BPC157, and then a person had a really bad outcome, went to the hospital, and then somebody wrote it up. That doesn't really exist, but there's no monitoring system here. So I'm not, I don't want to scare anybody. So I'm kind of like, I can't tell you there's harm here, but I also can't say that there's no harm. And ultimately, I know that annoys people, but it's kind of where I'm at here.
Yeah, that makes sense. You post a lot online about this. You get a lot of comments. Let's say you had to play the opposite side of the argument. You have to debate your current stance. What arguments would you be bringing against you? And then how would you answer those?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So the first argument would be like, well, look, the reason why there are no studies here is because now, since they're already out on the market, pharmaceutical companies, big pharma, can't actually make their money back, even though they did develop these things and did some initial research. And to that, I say, it's going to be harder for them. For sure. They will either have to create some sort of patented delivery system. For example, with the GLP-1 drugs, there's a delivery pen, patented, and that way is patented. They would have to somehow materially change the drug, adding something to it, taking something away to make it its own unique sort of thing. Or they would have to exercise like FDA's protective sort of pathways for orphan drugs or something like that, which generally are shorter than what a patent would last for. But what I'm getting at, there are ways to bring this to market to make money. And I guess the way I would argue against that position is like, look, we've been looking for something for pain, injury, rehab stuff. In the case of BPC 157, the multi-billion-dollar market. If there was something here that worked as well as what people are saying for BPC 157, even if it was only for a few years, that's a huge, huge return. And I suspect that pharma would leverage that. Yeah. So that's argument one. You can't make any money off this. It's like, I don't buy that. I just think ultimately, if these were allowed to be further sold by compounding pharmacies, by in research chemical and stuff like that, it makes the studies that we need less likely to be done, which is problematic ultimately if we want to help people. Yeah. Second argument here is that people will say, well, look, you're saying we don't know. We don't know the risks. We don't know the benefits. And so, but because there's no documented harms, they're probably safe. And to that I say, well, you can assume safety, but you know what they say about assumptions. And I'll give you a very classical example of this, fen-phen, right? Fenfluramine and phentermine, it's a combination drug that was combined together to be called fen-phen. Now, those drugs separately were approved. Okay. And what happened is so a physician was using these off-label combined together for weight loss. Because the two drugs separately were already FDA approved, the FDA approval for the combination drug was pushed right through, despite some people raising concerns like, we don't really know if the combination is safe. And further, the FDA approval on these two separate drugs were done for just short-term use, a few weeks for weight loss. Anyway, it was pushed through, and wouldn't you know it, 18 months later, all of these reports came out about heart valve sort of damage, which ultimately led to the fen-phen, sort of scandal. And you're like, so this is kind of a cautionary tale about like pushing something through when there's not really evidence there. And so even though there was no documented, harm beforehand, it's like no one really studied it. So you got to have some caution there, I think. And then the third thing that I would say argument that I make is that peptide drugs seem to be more accessible than other drugs that people have very serious reservations about using. For example, anabolic steroids. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to, in the gym, anabolic steroid use is quite high, even amongst recreational lifters compared to just competitive athletes. But people have real reservations about using them. And I think the biggest reservation is due to this this risk profile that people sort of think about, and further, the harder to get. And I'm like, well, I understand that, but we have reasonably good data on a lot of the anabolic agents because they have been used in humans. And further, there are legitimate ways to get them. compared to the current market for many of these peptide drugs. And so I don't know that that makes sense to me, where people are like, I would never use, anabolic steroids due to the potential safety risk. When the case here is, and maybe these might be even less safe. Or even when people say, they'll bring this up, they'll say, why do we trust the FDA? They had pushed the vaccine on us, the COVID vaccine. And I'm like, I hear that, understood. But what I'm hearing when people say that is that they didn't think that there was enough evidence on the COVID vaccines to like push them out, and certainly not to mandate them. Fair play. What do you think the evidence base is here for these peptide drugs? It doesn't seem like it's much better. In fact, it seems worse when you look at the actual human evidence here. And so I don't know. I don't suspect that's going to change anyone's mind. I just think,
but you're trying.
Let's be sophisticated about how we're thinking about this, and at least let's be logically consistent. Yeah.
Yeah. So with steroids, as you kind of mentioned, maybe you get those from the super jacked ex-con at the gym, or however the hell people get steroids. Where do
down the street? Yeah.
Where do people get peptides? What are the main sources? I talked to my friend Foster Kamer, who lives in New York City, and we have seen apparently bodegas in New York are selling peptides.
Yeah, that was actually reported in one of these FDA, one of these, it's not a hearing, right? Like a legal hearing, but one of these meetings, they were like, look, these people are selling these at bodegas. And even it's funny when you look at FDA's own data, and again, I keep going back to BPC 157 just because it's like one of the more popular drugs out there. If you look at the FDA's own reporting data, they'll say, well, look, from 2017 to now, there have been no approved prescriptions for BPC 157 that have been filled. No legitimate pharmacy has made these and distributed them, despite many people getting these from compounding pharmacies, and to a greater extent now, research chemical sort of websites where they kind of circumvent this approval process or prescription process by saying, hey, look, not for human use, which is a real problem in the latter. Research chemicals, by and large, do not go through the same sort of quality control steps, safety steps that a compounding pharmacy would use and that a regular pharmacy would use either. And so when you look at data on purity, for example, for research chemicals, it's not very good, meaning that many of the drugs will not have the active ingredient that's on the label in the thing.
Oh, wow.
Many will have other sort of illicit or even other prescription drugs in the substance. Many have not been screened for like endotoxins, heavy metals, this, that, and the other. And so you're injecting this, which is like a straight up pathway for if there's a bacteria in there, that's not good to inject bacteria into yourself, or heavy metals. And so, yeah, sourcing to me becomes a real problem. And so I guess if people were looking for a straight up do this, don't do this, if it's a research chemical, I'm pretty much saying no 100% of the time.
Really?
I think that's probably, yeah, it's just, you can't guarantee safety. And people say, well, look, there's this guy on the website and he's sending these things out to like a third-party lab. And look, lab report says clean. I'm like, what do they test for? Because I'm not seeing those results. I'm not seeing the endotoxin stuff. I'm not seeing the heavy metals. I'm not seeing the purity result. I'm just seeing like passed. It's like, look, we have a supplement line. Yeah, we have a supplement line, for example, right? And we don't advertise it, whatever. It just kind of sits there. And if people want our protein, they buy our protein, whatever. When I have to submit each batch for testing, it is a pretty extensive and expensive process to do that. And the reports I get, it's a whole portfolio with multiple pages, multiple readouts, a lot of chemistry there. And when I see these things online, I'm like, this doesn't seem sufficient to me, especially not for an injectable drug that, again, has potentially powerful effects. So research chemicals, I have a real problem with that. The compounding pharmacy to me is a little stranger because compounding pharmacies can be very, very useful. If something is off formulary, I mean, it's not in a regular pharmacy or you need a specialized dose or delivery mechanism or whatever, these compounding pharmacies can be very, very useful for creating medications for folks. But if they're making things that we don't have adequate evidence of, I'm not saying of safety or even efficacy, but like, what the hell is the drug? So, for example, every drug that should be compounded or could potentially be prescribed has to have what's called a monograph. It's like, look, here's what the chemical is, here's how you make it, this and the other. There's no monograph for BPC 157.
Interesting.
There's no monograph for many of these drugs. And so then you're like, well, what the heck are these people making? I'm like, I don't know, which is a problem. And so this is the last little bit of lore. I know I'm kind of rambling here, but
no, it's good.
When the reason why these were on what's called the Category 2 bulks list, which mainly drugs go here to die or to rot because there's a safety signal, meaning that there's either insufficient evidence to show that they're safe or there's evidence showing that they're unsafe. The only reason they got there is because people nominated them to be there. Effectively, these nominators will say, hey, look, take a look at this drug because we want to prescribe it. Or in this case, we've already been distributed it. The FDA looked at the packages that were submitted for these drugs and they said, what the heck is this? We don't even know that you got the wrong chemistry here or insufficient chemistry. You've insufficiently characterized this. There's no safety data. We got to put it on this list. Yeah. So these drugs have been on the Category 2 list. Those same nominators said, just kidding. We're withdrawing our nominations. That's why they came off the Category 2 list. And now they're orphaned. They're sitting in the ether, just waiting for either resubmission or for people to relook at them. And ultimately, that's what's happened here. The nominators rescinded their nominations. So they got pulled off the Category 2 list, and then there's been a vote. And the vote now suggests, look, of those peptides that were up for discussion, all of them, except for one, the DSIP, were approved or voted through to be reconsidered to move to the different lists where they could be distributed and made, which...
Tell us about that panel, because wasn't there some questions around how that all went down?
Oh, yeah. So career scientists at the FDA, I believe there were 7 of them, basically said, look, we don't have enough evidence that these are safe, that these are effective, that what they're made out of. We can't really approve these drugs. And so now that panel turns over on a regular basis. But in addition to that, there were some people added to the panel to vote on this particular issue, and all of them were from industry.
Meaning they had a peptide company, they had stake in peptides.
They distribute peptides, they have a vested interest in peptides, for example. And so the vote went exactly like this. Effectively, the FDA the scientists were like, no, we're not changing our vote, really. But then all of the industry people, now there were 8 of them, I believe, outranked them and said, yeah, we should probably move these off the list.
Interesting. And that happened just recently, right?
Yeah, that was the recent it's called a PCAC panel was convened, and they're going to vote again about a bunch of other drugs coming up in February of 2027 for some different agents, some different peptide drugs, and so nothing's really changed yet because the policy is still in place that look, compounding pharmacies shouldn't be making these things and distributing them, so that has to actually change for compounding pharmacies to really be able to make these legally. But I suspect this vote it has gotten misinterpreted, saying, look, they're FDA approved now. They're not FDA approved. FDA has not said, hey, look, these drugs have good evidence that they're safe, that they work on these indications, and people should prescribe them for those, or can prescribe them for these indications. And so watch this space. We'll see what happens. But yeah, if people's main claim is that the FDA is bought and paid for, follow the money. I'm like, well, cool, follow the money here too. Yeah. These are some problems, I think.
With some of the big providers online, something like Hims, I don't mean to pick on a specific company, but I feel like this is just the big one in the space, Hims and Hers. Are those compounding pharmacies or are they the research chemicals? Like, what are those?
I don't have great insight into their, manufacturing standards. To my knowledge, they're mostly doing compounding pharmacy work. Now, they bought Hims and Hers. They bought a manufacturing facility in 2025, 18 months ahead of this vote, by the way, to make that makes peptides.
Okay.
And so the day of the vote, their company stock jumped more than 10% intraday.
Wow.
And then the next day, Friday of last week, where they said, look, DSIP, we're not going to vote that. It went down. Okay. So people are actively watching this. I don't think they're making research chemicals, as far as my knowledge. It's all compounded stuff. But yeah, there's obviously, again, vested interest from industry in this sort of stuff. Yeah.
Why are they popular now? Because you mentioned we've sort of been studying peptides to some degree or another since, would you say, the 20s? BPC 157 was 1990. I had never heard about BPC 157 until, say, 2-3 years ago. So why is this a thing now?
That's a great question. I've been asked this a few times, and I think my answer keeps getting a little bit more sophisticated. I think, one, you have people this whole biohacking, optimization space has really, this is like the new longevity frontier, right? People looking for the fountain of youth, it's always been a thing since, early human time. And now it's just more, we have the internet. So now it's biohacking, right? It's not just the fountain of youth. So that's thing one. I think that's just like a cultural change. The other cultural change, which I think is maybe more, maybe been more powerful, is the normalization of injecting stuff. Right. And further injecting stuff that really, really works, because people have seen with GLP-1s dramatic sort of changes in their friends, family members, so on and so forth. So that's really like the sort of normalization of not only injecting stuff, but that it works. And so people are like, look, well, those are peptide drugs. It's in the name, GLP-1. What's the P stand for? It's peptide. And so, yeah, all of that has been normalized. Whereas like anabolic steroids never really did get normalized, right? Again, there's still this sort of stigma against those comparatively. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just, I think that never happened with those drugs, but it has been normalized with these drugs. That's my take on it. I'd be curious to get your thoughts or other people's thoughts, because I'm not sure that's airtight, but that seems like, at least temporally, what's happened, and it makes sense to me.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you said. I think also politically with the MAHA movement, I think there's something there. I think these sort of drugs got latched onto as a sort of solution outside the normal pharmaceutical path as well. It's like you could kind of take control of your health, and then you could go directly to a company and get these things that supposedly improve your health. I think there's that. And there's probably a bunch of other factors that I haven't considered.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's just like, look, if you've got an aunt or somebody who used used Ozempic or whatever, and they lost, 30 pounds or whatever, and everything was hunky-dory, safe, and they got it through a legit pharmacy, and everything came in a nice sealed, package or whatever. You're like, oh, these are great. These are great. Yeah, all the peptides probably work the same way. They have the same level of evidence. Yeah. I do wonder, I mentioned the vaccine thing earlier, but you have people who, when GLP-1s started really, really making a push, they were like, oh, this not only is it cheating, but like, these are dangerous. Look out for the long-term effects, right? How many of those people are now considering using peptides or actively using these other peptide drugs that have far less evidence, not only of like the safety and efficacy, but like even benefit? You could make an argument that as far as longevity goes, that some of these GLP-1 drugs actually have an even stronger signal than any of these drugs on the list. But this is me just saying stuff that's probably going to get me in trouble online, I think.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time.
That's true.
Very basic question. Do you have any idea how much these things cost?
No, not really. Mainly because these different research chemical websites, I don't know that anybody's doing like a big market research report and like, what is everybody else selling BPC for? What's most interesting is that it does seem to be where different organizations who make and sell or otherwise offer people these drugs are trying to differentiate themselves by offering either different forms or different like stacks. So for example, the Wolverine stack, right? TB 500, BPC 157. One company might list them separately, right? And say, look, you want the Wolverine stack, here are the two separate vials you get, you mix this, you mix that, you put them together, that's your dose. Other people say, oh no, look, we already combined it to one, right? And then another company will say, oh, well, we're going to make this an oral version, despite these drugs not being orally available by any stretch of the imagination. Ultimately, research chemicals end up being much, much cheaper than a compounding pharmacy. And some of that is due to the, again, quality control and the production process, but also you don't have to go to a doctor to get a research chemical prescribed to you, right? So there's no physician's fee, there's none of that. Whereas either a brand name drug or getting like brand name Wegovy or Ozempic compared to research compound semaglutide, you're talking about hundreds of dollars worth of differences here. And so I do empathize. Imagine you're a person, an individual with obesity, and you have been sold on the idea that a GLP-1 would benefit you, which is likely to be true.
Yeah.
Okay. You go to your doctor and you're like, look, I'd really like to be prescribed Ozempic or Zepbound, Mounjaro, something like that. And they say, okay, great. You qualify. We're going to write the prescription. Their insurance company comes back and says, look, we're not going to cover it. So you have to pay out of pocket. And while there are direct to consumer sort of pathways here and coupons or whatever, you're still looking at a couple $100 a month.
Yeah.
And they're like, I can't really swing that, but I could swing the research chemical one, which is, $50 a month, for example. And a person might say, look, they're probably the same safety, signal here. It's the same drug, right? How could it be different? It's like, yeah, well, the manufacturing process and the delivery process is all different. So unfortunately, not as safe as we'd like, but I do empathize, because it's like, if you believe you are likely to benefit from this drug, but you don't have the resources to go through the appropriate channels, which I wish it were better. I understand why people make this decision, for sure.
Yeah, totally. So big picture, patient comes to you, says they're interested in peptides. What's the first thing you tell them? Like if you're just talking to an average person.
Yeah, great question. I would, it's mostly exploratory. What are you looking to do with this peptide? What, and sort of let them talk. I want to know what their belief system is, how they arrived at this a decision, right? And generally what I've heard with people I've done consultations work with is that they say, look, everybody's saying, again, BPC 157, this is going to make me feel better. I've had this joint pain for months and months and months. I've been trying all this sort of stuff and it hasn't worked. I'm willing to try. I'm kind of desperate here, doc. And that I do understand. And so now I'm trying to have a pretty careful conversation about informed consent. Me personally, I'm not going to prescribe it at this point, because I think ultimately my duty is like, look, I don't know that this is safe and I don't know that it's effective. So when I'm trying to have this informed consent sort of discussion, I'm blind on both sides. Yeah. So it's very challenging for me. But my expectation is that they're likely to obtain it themselves in that regard. And so the conversation then turns to, well, what should we do to monitor you, right? It's like a harm reduction type thing. And so that would go into sourcing. I would prefer a compounding pharmacy to a research chemical. I would prefer ongoing monitoring. A series of blood tests would be like the bare minimum. But even then, I don't really know what I'm looking for. Should we be doing cardiac ultrasounds, every few months to make sure it doesn't affect a heart valve? Should we be doing colonoscopies, regularly to make sure that, one of the mechanisms that BPC 157 is supposed to work through is by creating new blood vessels, angiogenesis. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, what if it did it in a polyp in your gut, in your bowel, and that polyp grew and became cancerous? Should we be doing serial colonoscopies? I don't know. So some of that monitoring stuff is mostly like a CYA, and CYA is covering as my grandmother would say, tuchus. But to an extent, I'm just trying to say, let's look at some stuff and at least like do our best. But ultimately, that's kind of how that conversation goes. It's like, why are you considering it? What's the motivation? Where are you going to get it from? What can we do to monitor you? And are there any other options that we feel like has good evidence for effect here? And in the case of joint pain, I think we have a lot of better options at this particular time than BPC 157 until more evidence comes out to sway my opinion. Some people aren't going to like that. I understand, but that's just kind of where I sit as a physician trying to like parse this together and make some practical recommendations.
I really like how you put it through the lens of harm reduction. If you are like, okay, this person's going to do it no matter what. It's kind of like, your friend comes to you and says, I think I'm going to buy weed. And you're like, all right, please don't buy it from that sketchy dude on the corner who maybe sprinkled it with fentanyl. Like, let's make sure you go to the place where it's actually like tested, verified. There's not anything sketchy in there.
Yeah. Harm reduction, that's what some people are bringing up here. They're like, well, look, if people are going to use these things anyway, let's give them access to like legit compounding pharmacies, which you'd expect to have higher quality manufacturing processes and distribution processes than a research chemical business, which I agree is true. The problem with that argument around peptides here is that in typical harm reduction doesn't like increase exposure, right? Effect like a needle exchange, for example. It's like, look, people are going to use this stuff anyway. Let's make sure they have clean needles. Yeah. For peptides, if you move it to this compounding pharmacy list where it's able to be compounded and prescribed and distributed, and now you've got a company like Hims or Hers that might be taking out like TV ads, all this sort of stuff. Well, exposure's gone up now. That's not really harm reduction. And further, if you were kind of looking for evidence that these things are safe and that they work, well, now you've kind of made that even harder to do, because who in their right mind is going to want to study this sort of stuff when it's already on the market already? And so right now the market is mostly research chemicals, which is a problem. I agree. I would just want some better evidence before it kind of moved to something we could prescribe. Yeah. Just a little bit.
I'm going to land the plane here. 10 years from now, do you think we're going to have better human data? And do you think we'll be using these more frequently? Or do you think this is a fad for now? This is a fad in 10 years.
That's a great question. I do think there's going to be more peptide drugs that are FDA approved and have great evidence. Great, not meaning that they're like incredibly effective or incredibly safe, but just better evidence, great evidence to show like, here's the actual safety profile, here's the efficacy. I don't know that it's going to be on these agents, mainly because they've already kind of made their way into the market. And so for all those reasons in the current administration and what's going on right now, that's a big hill to climb. That said, in the pipeline right now, there already are dozens of other peptide drugs that if they go through the appropriate channels that we currently have, I suspect in 10 years, yeah, we're going to have more stuff that's approved. I just don't know that it's going to be these ones, except for, again, maybe some of the newer agents. But even then, I'm still a little, I'm not as optimistic. But I could be wrong. And I hope I am. I hope, like, look, if all of these came out, they were incredibly safe, incredibly effective, and we have even a smidgen of evidence showing that, I would be very, very happy. I would celebrate them. And good, I have more tools in my toolbox now. But I don't think these are going to be the ones in 10 years that we're all talking about.
Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum, that was awesome. I have left this with way more knowledge about peptides than I started. I think everyone else who listens to this will as well. Where can people find you?
Yep. If you search barbell medicine on the internet, you will find all of our stuff, good, bad, or otherwise. Just know that
it's good.
I'm not coming after you or any of your peptides. I just think we should have an intelligent conversation about them.
I love it. And you got a good Instagram feed as well. Big fan of it. So yeah, I appreciate what you're doing, man. I appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for checking out the show, and thanks to Foster Kamer and Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum for jumping on. They are both excellent follows on Instagram, so check them out. As a reminder, we are in your feeds twice a week, so please keep an eye out for more. Hit subscribe, give us a like, that way you'll get updates on every new episode. And as always, have fun, don't die, and definitely do not buy peptides from bodegas.